Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, a 7-year-old talks about his first day back to school. We also talk about India's 16-year-old Praggnanandhaa defeating the chess world number 1 Magnus Carlsen. But first, we talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Over the past few weeks, tensions between Russia and Ukraine have been escalating. Russia right now has thousands of troops deployed around the Ukraine borders, and the fear is that it might invade the country soon. In this segment, Indian Express's associate editor Shubhajit Roy, who reports on matters of foreign affairs for the paper, joins us to talk about this crisis, the latest developments, and why the Russian President Vladimir Putin is doing this. Shubhajit, tensions between Russia and Ukraine have been going on for a number of years. But what do we know about how these latest tensions began?
Well, start with, we have to go back to the history in the post-90s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, these countries which were part of the Soviet Union, they became independent and they pursued their independent foreign policy. But there was understanding between the Russians and the West, led by the US, that there would be a sort of a buffer zone where Russia's security will be guaranteed and NATO and the Western powers will not deploy military or its assets in these countries. So essentially not threaten Russia at all, because Russia had liberalized, it had given independence to broken away into several countries, a dozen countries or more. So that was the understanding. Now, in the last few years, what has happened was the West has gained much more influence in these countries where Russia was the dominant influence till the early 90s.
And this includes Ukraine.
This includes Ukraine. And that is where the tension started between Russia and the West, where Putin says that don't come near my border, stay away from the border, keep the buffer zone, guarantee the security, and keep to your commitments. The West and the US say that it is a sovereign choice or an option, independent choice of these independent countries. So now that is where the tension lies. And in the last few years, Ukraine has been sort of handheld by the Americans by giving defense supplies, defense equipment. And so that has spooked Russia. And Putin wants to recreate the Soviet influence because he feels that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest disaster, biggest catastrophe of 20th century. So therefore, he wants to regain that influence, that sphere of influence. And that's where it wants to push back the West. And that's where the tension started. And Ukraine has become the focal point or the fulcrum where this tension is playing out right now.
And right now the fear is that Russia will invade Ukraine. It has a lot of forces deployed around the Ukrainian borders. There was a buildup of about 130,000 troops, which took place within a period of about a month and a half. And recently, one of the major developments we saw was that Russia recognized 2 separatist regions of eastern Ukraine as independent. Could you talk about this development and maybe give an example of this in the Indian context?
So, Shashank, essentially, Putin doesn't want Ukraine to go to US or NATO's or Europe's influence. So it has now surrounded the country from all 3 sides with troops, with about 130,000 troops, with sophisticated weaponry, etc. And it has recognized 2 regions where there is already unrest, there has been separatists, which are backed by the Russians. So to give you an example between India and Pakistan, say for example, tomorrow Pakistan recognizes the Jammu and Kashmir, which belongs to India, which is an integral part of India. And there is a separatism, which is India alleges that Pakistan supports that. So how would India react? So that is the kind of situation where you put Russia, Ukraine and the West. That is where Russia is annoyed, angry at the West, and the West is angry at the Russians for recognizing these two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. And that has precipitated the crisis where it looks like to protect the interests, its own interests, Russia would invade those parts and may step in to support those separatists.
And right now, everyone has their eyes on this situation. And one thing that has now happened is that a number of countries, including the US, European Union, Australia, Canada, and Japan, they have all imposed sanctions on Russia. Could you talk about what these sanctions are trying to signal to Russia and how will they impact the country?
So sanctions are essentially trying to signal that there are severe consequences and nothing hurts a leader or a government or a regime more than financial consequences. So these sanctions are targeted towards not just the Russian president, but the top elite. They are targeting the big industrialists, which the West calls them as oligarchs, who are Putin's friends. And it's trying to impose costs on them. But Russia, over the period of years, it has faced sanctions earlier as well. And it has tried to sanction-proof its economy. So it has really invested in indigenous development, something like a Make in Russia sort of a campaign. And it is quite evident right now that has worked. And because Russia is a very mineral-rich country, and with oil and gas and minerals at its disposal, it has been able to ride out these sanctions over the last decade or so. But now we'll have to see if it impacts and pinches the elite and Putin's closest circle. Then how will that play out? Whether it hurts them or it ultimately ends up hurting the people of Russia.
And Shubhajit, earlier this week on Tuesday, India issued a statement on the situation. It said that the escalation of tensions along the border between Ukraine and the Russian Federation was a matter of serious concern, and that these developments had the potential to undermine the peace and security in the region. So break this statement down for us. What exactly is India trying to signal through it?
So there are a few takeaways. First is India did not condemn or criticize Russia for its actions, which is recognition of these provinces, the regions which are part of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. So essentially, India took the middle path, a diplomatic tightrope, because India has few concerns. First is India is largely very heavily dependent on Russia for its military supplies. Imagine the entire basket of India's military supplies. Out of every 10 equipment, 6 or 7 come from Russia. So you need to service those equipment with Russian help, especially when India and China are locked in a border standoff for almost 2 years now. Then India cannot afford to disrupt that supply or annoy that supplier that it can potentially be used as a leverage. So Russia has this tremendous leverage over India on that. The second thing is that India has about 20,000 nationals, including mostly students who study in the medical colleges in Ukraine. They're very popular for the last several decades. And their safety, security is also of utmost priority for the Indian government. In fact, India has started ferrying some flights through commercial airline now. And the other takeaway from that particular statement was that it also tried to signal to Russia that when India said that such developments, such actions undermine the peace and security, and that is a signal to Russia that it should not carry out those actions. So that is the core of key takeaways of that Indian statement.
Right, and Russia, of course, has welcomed this statement. It called India's approach balanced, principled, and independent. But talking about the 20,000 odd Indian nationals, mostly students in Ukraine, what is India planning to do and what has it done to ensure that they return safely to India?
So India has issued a few advisories. It has asked its Indian nationals to leave the country temporarily as soon as possible because Kyiv airport, which is Ukraine capital's airport, is still functional. Commercial airlines are functioning. while KLM stopped flights, but some others are still functioning. So it has asked its students, nationals, to get out of the country temporarily. In fact, on Tuesday, they issued a fresh advisory where they said that don't wait for the colleges to move to online classes. Just leave the country. And the Indian Embassy is trying to work with the universities and colleges to start online classes so that they don't miss out on those classes. So India is trying that. And it has also facilitated some extra flights operated by Air India, which is now controlled by Tata's. So that is what is happening right now. I think there are about 3 flights that have been arranged so far, and more are being arranged. So that is the state of play as of now.
And Shubhajit, what would you say is the biggest fear when it comes to this situation right now?
Well, the biggest fear is that if there is an escalation and if there's a conflict between the two sides, which is Russia on the one side and Ukrainian forces backed by the Western powers, which is Europe, NATO, and led by the US. So if that breaks out, if there's an invasion, and that I think is the biggest concern, not just for India, but all over the world, and how it impacts the economy, because if these sanctions and if this conflict affects the oil and gas economy, so the oil prices might go up internationally, and that will again have a direct impact on India's economy as well, as India is also a large importer of energy from different sources.
And next we talk about schools. Over the past 2 years, since the pandemic first hit in March 2020, schools across the country have been disrupted. And this has significantly impacted children, especially those who didn't have access to smartphones and computers at home to access online classes. In Delhi, for example, schools for primary and middle school kids had largely been closed throughout this time. But they finally opened last week on Monday. And on this day, Indian Express's Sukrita Baruah followed one kid as he returned back to school. We now speak to her about what she found out. So Sukrita, before you introduce us to this kid, could you talk about the kind of things we heard from parents and experts during this period when schools were closed, about the kind of problems this had caused?
So for a really long time, I would say up to the second wave, there was a lot of fear among the parents as well, and not a lot of people were keen on sending their kids to school. But I think things changed considerably during that long stretch of low cases that we saw between the second wave and the Omicron wave. And that's when we started hearing a lot more voices of support for schools reopening. So in September, schools reopened for older kids. So then the question amongst parents and even among smaller kids was, why not open for the younger kids? Especially because early education is crucial, not just academically, not just with regard to the learning gap that we hear about all the time, but also their cognitive development, their social skills, for play, for essential physical activity. And a lot of parents and experts who are pushing for reopening also said that, there was really no logic for keeping these younger kids at home for so long when everything else, markets, bars, restaurants, weddings, everything was happening, and the adults of the family and even the kids were going for this. So it really didn't make sense what was the additional risk that them going to school would have posed in that case.
And one of the major things we also heard from people was that this is not sustainable for a lot of children because of the huge digital divide in India, right?
Right. And a lot of families didn't have gadgets, or if they did, the priority was always for the oldest child. So if there was a family with multiple kids, so siblings, the elder sibling would always get precedence. So if it's a class 9 or class 10 student, of course, they were given priority for access to the device. Even in terms of the digital divide, it was really the younger kids who bore the brunt the hardest.
Okay, so schools in Delhi finally opened last week, and you decided to follow this one particular kid on his first day back to school. Who was this kid?
So this was Mohammad Zaid. He's a 7-year-old child. He's a class 2 student. And the last time he was in school in March 2020, he was just a 5-year-old completing kindergarten. So he had been away from school for all of class 1 and most of class 2, which are his first 2 years of formal schooling. He's a student of a government school in Piragari village, that's in West Delhi. And he's from a working class family. They live in West Delhi's Nihal Vihar, which is an unauthorized colony. His father, Dilshad Ali, is a daily wage carpenter. His mother does sewing work at home, as and when such work comes by. This child is the youngest of 3 siblings. He has 2 sisters. His eldest sister, Saima, is in class 10. She's a student in a government school as well. And the other sister is Uzma, who's a class 5 student, and she's an EWS student in a private school in Northwest Delhi.
Okay, so take us through that day. Where did you guys start?
So I had reached his home at 7 a.m. And when I reached home, he was still fast asleep. And his sister Uzma was sitting by him. And she finally managed to coax him awake at 7:15. And, his family was telling me that he's not used to waking up this early. He's been spending the last few weeks at his grandmother's house where he's been thoroughly indulged. And when I first reached, he was quite shy. But when I kept trying to speak to him, he opened up and he turned out to be this really chatty little kid. So he was extremely excited about getting back to school. So while his mother was in the kitchen making tea for the family, he got out of bed himself and started wearing his little blue uniform by himself. And then she entered the room and said, "You haven't even brushed your teeth." So she made him take off all his clothes and took him to the bathroom and made him freshen up.
जल्दी तैयार हो गए हैं
बस उतना ही ठीक है
इसमें नहीं गीली हो जाएगी फिर कहोगे मैं नहीं पहन रहा
मैं पहनूंगा तब भी
गीले पहन लोगे कपड़े
हाँ
गंदा बच्चा
And what were the kind of things that Zaid was excited about?
So when I asked him, Zaid, what are you excited about school? And he claimed that he was just excited about पढ़ाई.
तो आप किस चीज के लिए एक्साइटेड हो? स्कूल में क्या क्या करोगे आज आप?
पढ़ाई
और
बस पढ़ाई करूंगा
बस पढ़ाई और फ्रेंड्स को मिलना?
आपके
हाँ,
स्कूल में
हाँ।
झूले भी तो हैं
हाँ
झूले हैं? आज खेलोगे झूले पर?
थोड़ा
झूले
बहुत
बहुत पसंद है
And then I asked him about meeting friends, and he said that he couldn't remember his friends. And he just said that he had a friend called Ayush Kumar, but he didn't really remember who this child is. He just remembered this name. So he was really, really unsure about, how that part of his day was going to play out.
Okay, so he goes to school after this. I believe his father drops him in an e-rickshaw. What happens after he reaches school? How did his day begin?
So, as is the case in government schools, his day began with a happiness class. So, the teacher conducted a mindfulness session, which is basically a sort of meditation session. And this was followed by storytelling, where the teacher told them a story and, asked them informal questions about it. And he was really quiet through this. Then the first lesson of the day began, which is a maths class on days of the week. And following this, they had this little playground session where the teacher took them out for 15 minutes. And that's where all the kids had a real blast. And Zaid was a little scared of getting on the slide. He had never been on a slide before. But every single time he'd reach the bottom of the slide, he'd jump off and yell, "Yippee." That must have been something he saw in cartoons. And this was followed by a lunch session. And that's where, the kids really got talking and they spoke to each other. And then they had a Play-Doh session and they really enjoyed that as well. So the school gave them Play-Doh kits and they made flowers and strawberries and houses. And they had a great time.
And this part, kids playing together, having fun together, this is something that teachers right now are focusing on, right? Considering that schools have opened after such a long time.
At least in Zaid's school, this is something that they're really focusing on because this is something that these younger kids have really missed out on in these last 2 years. So like Zaid, most of his classmates are from working class families. And they live in homes and neighborhoods where there's not much space for them to play around in at all. I mean, Zaid's house is in this really narrow gully. So there's really no room to play. The house is a one-room house. And like his parents, a lot of parents are not comfortable with letting these kids go to parks in the area. So the schools are really focusing on letting them get back into this, which helps them to break down the ice. It helps them make friends. It gets them ready to get back to learning and getting them enthusiastic about getting back to school every day. And this is something that has also been emphasized by Zaid's own teachers. So his primary section in charge, Anil Jakhar, had spoken about this.
स्कूल में आने के बाद सबसे बड़ी छोटे बच्चों के लिए जो सबसे अच्छी बात है, उनको पार्क मिल रहा है, उनको फ्रेंड सर्कल मिल रहा है, अपने फ्रेंड सर्कल से कनेक्ट, जो भूल चुका है, जो केजी क्लास में बच्चा था उसको ये भी नहीं पता कि आपका फ्रेंड सर्कल स्कूल में आपके पीयर्स कौन कौन थे, वो सब भूल चुका है. तो टीचर्स का मेनली पर्पज ये है नेक्स्ट 15 डेज तक कि वो उसका फ्रेंड सर्कल, वो एनवायरनमेंट दोबारा से क्रिएट करे जहाँ से बच्चा डिस्कनेक्ट हो गया था 2019 में, प्री कोविड स्टेज में था वहीं.
And Sukrita, the importance of friendship is something many teachers emphasize on. What did you find out about Zaid's friends?
Like I said, Zaid couldn't remember any of his friends that he used to have in school. He mentioned 2 friends that he has in his neighborhood, and that's all. He spent almost all his time in the last 2 years with his family. Zaid could only remember that he had a friend named Ayush Kumar. And after that little playground session, he asked this little boy in front of him, "Dost inme se Ayush Kumar kaun hai?" Because he suddenly remembered that there was a friend whose name he actually did know. And that boy pointed out this boy on the other side of the classroom. And Zaid got really excited and he said, "Acha, so that's my friend Ayush Kumar."
दोस्त इसमें से आयुष कुमार कौन है? आयुष कुमार वो बैठा सामने जो रोटी खा रहा है. अच्छा वो है मेरा दोस्त.
आयुष, तुम उसको याद है? जैद याद है तुम्हें? नहीं याद.
अरे मैं ही हूँ तेरा दोस्त.
And then Ayush seemed to recall and he said, "Acha, abhi yaad aaya." So, Zaid was really delighted after this. And he told me that he's sure that, as and when he plays with all the other boys, they'll all become his friends.
अभी मेरा मन दोस्त है ना,
हाँ.
अभी एक बन गया, दूसरा भी बना लूंगा. ये जो सारे दोस्त है मेरे, उनका तो अभी तक नाम नहीं पता, पर जब मैं इनके साथ खेलूंगा ना, ये मुझे खुद नाम बता देंगे.
Okay, so making friends is one aspect of going to school. But what did you notice about how kids were reacting to physical classes? A teacher in person teaching them lessons.
One thing I noticed for all the kids in the class is that they were just so happy to speak in class. So, of course, they were enjoying the teaching, learning part of it, but they were also so keen to participate, to show the teacher what they know.
इन दोनों को जोड़ो. क्या? और इसको जोड़ो. तो रेल क्यों बोल रहे थे? रेल क्यों बोल रहे थे? हाँ, इन्होंने गलत पढ़ा. नहीं, गलत.
So, clearly they were enjoying learning in the class. They were no longer distant from the learning activity. They were also really keen to just speak and be in this place where they could speak to the teacher. These are small kids. They're really close to their class teachers, who's known as a mother teacher, and to show the other boys as well what they know. So I don't think there's any comparison between the environment that they had with remote teaching, learning and classes. They were genuinely joyful about learning in that environment.
And you also spoke to Zaid's parents. What did they have to tell you about the challenges they faced, during the time when schools were closed?
So a lot of the things that I had observed in the classroom and that Zaid's teachers had spoken to me about were actually reiterated by Zaid's parents during my conversations with them. And they also felt the same way. So Zaid's parents are quite invested in their kids' education, but they felt really limited about what they could do to keep them engaged during this time. And, he was the youngest kid. And his eldest sister is in class 10. So her need for the phone was given priority in the household. She had online classes. So by the time Zaid would get access to the phone, it would be evening. He would get it for a limited time. The phone would run out of charge. So they felt quite bad about that.
एक मोबाइल है जिसके हिसाब से पढ़ाई कर लेते हैं.
तो छोटे वाला को तो चांस ही नहीं मिलता होगा.
नहीं, इसका तो बहुत कम मिलता था चांस पढ़ाई करने का. इसको टाइम निकल जाता था ऑनलाइन क्लासेस का जो भी होता था. पहले छोटी बेटी फिर बड़ी बेटी.
And they were also conscious that this prolonged confinement at home could disturb them mentally and emotionally. But they also weren't comfortable about them being out and about in the neighborhood.
जैसे स्कूल में एक्टिविटी होते खेलना कूदना यार दोस्त बच्चों के साथ घूमना खेलना कूदना होता है, वो चीज़ घर पर कहाँ पाती है. भाई या तो छत पर जाके बैठ जाओ या घर में बंद रहो. तो बाहर तो हम भेजते नहीं थे बच्चों को बिल्कुल भी.
यहाँ का माहौल ठीक नहीं है हमारे हिसाब से, तो वो अपने बच्चों को इसी रखते हैं, ये रखो.
घर में ज्यादा रहते हैं.
हाँ, घर में ज्यादा रहते हैं, मैं बाहर नहीं छोड़ती. माहौल यहाँ का बहुत बेकार है.
So they try their best to engage them within that limited space, with their limited options, with games around the house like Ludo and Carom. And his eldest sister helped them with his school worksheets and other activities and assignments that he was getting from school. But one thing that I think Zed does have behind him that other kids may or may not have is that his family is really invested in their education. And his father has studied till class 9 and his mother has studied till class 10. And the father would keep talking about that I have no options in life. I just have to wait for work to come by every day. But I don't want my children to go through that. And I want them to be able to study so that they can be self-sufficient, they can be independent, and they don't have to go through the same experience that their parents did.
पढ़े लिखे अपने पैरों पर खड़े हों, शादी के ऊपर डिपेंड ना रहे कि जी शादी होगी तो कुछ करेंगे. खुद इस लायक बनो कि किसी के मोहताज ना बनो जिंदगी में. क्योंकि जिस टाइम मैं अपने ससुराल से निकली थी, हमारे पास कुछ नहीं था, यहाँ तक कि किराए के पैसे भी नहीं थे. हम लोगों ने ऐसा दिन भी निकाले. तो मैं नहीं चाहती मेरे बच्चे किसी पे भी डिपेंड रहे.
And in the end, we talk about the young Indian Grandmaster R. Praggnanandhaa. During an online rapid chess tournament that took place earlier this week, the 16-year-old Praggnanandhaa beat the world number 1 Norwegian chess grandmaster Magnus Carlsen. In this segment, Indian Express's Sandip Gopal joins us to talk about the significance of this win and what it means for India. And he starts by telling us a bit about Praggnanandhaa himself.
So, Praggnanandhaa is a very familiar name for those in the chess circuit because, he became youngest international master ever. So, that is the first rung you make in a chess, in competitive chess. And then he was vying to be the youngest grandmaster in the world. A record that belonged to Sergei Karyakin, and which was beaten by a boy of Indian origin, United States, called Abhimanyu Mishra. But Praggnanandhaa missed it by a whisker. Just a few months, he could not compete in as many tournaments as he had thought. And so, but that is still a great landmark. He was the third fastest ever to be a grandmaster. Just to put things in perspective, Vishwanathan Anand became a grandmaster at the age of 18. Those were different times, but still, it shows how much of a talent this young boy is. He's a prodigy, strictly speaking, in chess terms.
And Sandeep, how many Indians have defeated Magnus Carlsen before?
Just two. I think one was Vishwanathan Anand and the other was P. Harikrishna. But both of them were very established players. I think Anand beat Carlsen when he was in his 40s. Whereas Harikrishna also was much more experienced than Praggnanandhaa when he beat Carlsen. But just to put a rider, he beat him in the rapid format, not the classical version. Classical version, it's a bit like Test match cricket and T20 cricket. So, Praggnanandhaa has beaten Magnus Carlsen in a T20 kind of a match. But the classical format still waits.
And talk a bit about the game itself. How was he playing against Carlsen?
He was operating with black pieces, which itself is a handicap, but he started off aggressively. One of his biggest strengths and the reason why he's such a good player in the rapid formats is that he's a very aggressive boy. A 16-year-old, you imagine him to be a bit aggressive. And he started off aggressively and actually he could have won the match right in the middle game. But he just made a very cautious move. So again, Carlsen was back in the game. And then finally he had a superb end game to finish the game in 39 moves. It was a very sweaty kind of a victory. But, beating Carlsen won't be as easy as this.
Right, of course. And tell us what Praggnanandhaa's win and his achievements mean for India. Because India has been looking for its next Vishwanathan Anand for a while.
He can build on this, definitely. Post Anand, we had a lot of very good players, but not someone of Anand's class. Praggnanandhaa is still a long way from reaching Anand's class or equating him to Anand, but there is a lot of promise. He should be among the most promising young chess players around. I don't think anyone in recent times have been as prodigiously gifted as this boy. So, these are good tidings for Indian chess in general. We are starting the chess league also from June. So, you have a kind of a new poster boy to look forward to. And he's a very grounded boy. He's a very hardworking guy who keeps on working. Now he's spending a lot of time with Anand also. So, he's getting the right kind of grooming. And then there are a lot of positive influences around him. So, it's overall, it augurs well for Indian chess.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.